Hello, today in this video we are going to jump into the mysterious methods. Let's get to it. Like always, if you're new here, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe below, and you can catch really cool content just like this one. So when we are talking about methods and functions, we're talking about a group of code that is grouped together to perform a specific task. And what they are used for is we're able to run some logic, return values, as well as to group all of them into common functionalities. And typically, if you're doing two things into one method, or if you're doing multiple things, you may want to break them up into multiple methods and functions. Now, you're probably wondering, why are we calling them method or functions? Are there a difference between the two? And the answer to that question is no. Functions and methods, they're all part of the same thing. They all work the same way. It's just depending on the programming language, it is referenced either function or is referenced between methods. But it's just a different name for the same exact thing. So when I'm referring to methods and functions, I can use them interchangeably. They all mean the same thing. But in some programming language, it may require you to use functions or it may require you to use methods. Now, let's talk a little bit about scope, because this kind of plays a huge role when we are working within our functions. And when we're talking about scope, it's essentially where you have access to a particular variable. Just as a quick review, if you haven't seen the video, click right there. But just to note that we have a lot of different scopes. We have the global, file, class, and local. But the one that we are going to talk about is the local as well as the code block. Because when we are defining the variables within our methods, then we only have access to them within the methods, unless we change them depending on the scope. So now let me show you how functions work. And again, I'm using functions here because this is going to be JavaScript. If you're working in another language, it might be a method or it might be written in a different way. So it really does depend on which languages you are working in, and the functions or methods will look differently. So here with JavaScript, how you signify a function is with the keyword function. And then after that, it comes with the name that you are referencing the function. And then it comes with these parentheses here. And then a set of ending and opening brackets. And whatever's inside of those brackets, that is what is going to be run when you call the method. So what I mean by calling the method is that when we are going to create the method here, we just create it within these curly braces here. So you can put whatever code that is relevant inside of these two curly braces. But then those code that you put in the curly braces doesn't actually run until you call the method. So to call the method, you call it by name and then you do the parentheses here in most cases. So if I want this to run, I can't just write this inside of my code. I actually need to call it. And this will run every single time that it's called. So you can call this multiple times. It will always run the item that is within the code block there. And sometimes you would see the keyword return, as well as if there's no return. So essentially when we are using return, that is going to be the given value after we are done using the function. So that is returning, in this case, 5. That is the return value. In some languages, you have to explicitly say return. In other languages, the last line you write is return. So you may not even need to write the return keyword here. So that is essentially how functions work. But there is a different type of functions, and we'll take a look at it over here. So the difference between these two functions is that with this function here, we actually have parameters or arguments. Again, they're both different words for the same meaning. Essentially, you are passing in an argument within the function, and they represent something within the function, and you're able to use and reference them later on. It's very similar of how you create variables in a sense, where this is only scoped within your function, but they're actually called parameters and arguments. So this here represents the item that you're passing in for the first parameter. And order does matter. Like if we have num1 and num2 here, when you are calling the function, you need to pass in something for num1, which is 4 here, and something for num2, which is 1 here. So order does matter, and you can have as many arguments as you can, as well as to use them as much as possible. The only thing is that you need to pass in just as many here to represent what they are within the function. So how this works is that since this one needs to pass in arguments, I am going to pass in 4 and 1. So 4 is now num1 and 1 is now num2. So then I would return the value of 4 plus 1, which is 5. So this will give you a 5 when it is returned. So there are two different types of functions. One we don't pass anything in, and the other we do pass in parameters. And the thing about this is that if these two functions are in the same file, it might, depending on the language, give you an error because it does have the same name. And we'll talk about naming next. So it has to be very unique name depending on the language, and also parameter matters. If I just call sum here, but I don't pass in any parameters here, it thinks that I'm referencing to this function here. So if you are calling a function, you need to have it be with the right parameters as well. So when we are naming our functions, it's very similar of how we are naming our variables. We need to be specific and also follow the language's best practice, meaning that if it's camel case or if it's capitalized, you need to follow those conventions just so it will look a lot more clear and it will also work efficiently as possible. And again, don't use keywords. Don't use like instead of sum you're calling it as class or function. That will really screw up your language up, and then it will also break your code. And the typical rule of thumb is that you should name your function of what the function is actually doing. In this case, we're summing up all the numbers, so that's a good name. So you would name all your functions as descriptive as possible, naming them of what the function is actually doing. So let's go into bad examples of naming. So let's say that we have the function name x. That's too broad, and x could be a lot of things. And also here we have the function name of function, which is a keyword like that will give you an error. It thinks that you're creating a function and another function. This one is actually too broad. It's not as descriptive enough. So a better thing to do is that name the function specific as possible and using non-keywords here. So this one will, if you read it, it is in charge of summing up the numbers. And then here, that from reading it, that it is printing out all of the cars. So that is a pretty good example of how you should name your functions as well as how it is used. So now let's go ahead and review some terms. When we are talking about methods and functions, those are the exact same thing. It just means that it's a group of code that performs a specific task. And it's very similar of how in math, you get one input and then you get another output from there. That is very similar of how we are creating our methods, especially when we are having an input of num here and then we are giving an output with the return. So if you think of it that way, it's just performing a specific task with or without given inputs for methods and functions. And the difference between methods and functions is just programming language. And then with scope, which is where you have access to certain elements, especially with variables. These aren't variables, they're actually called parameters and arguments. That is what you are passing through to be able to use and represent what the user is passing through within the function call. So make sure that when you are using these elements, you only have access to them within the curly brace within the code block. And if you're defining any variables within the function and it's function or locally scoped, it is still inside of this particular scope here because you're defining it within this scope. So when we are talking about parameters and arguments, order does matter. So num1 and num2 does matter in this particular case because that represents this particular first argument, and then num2 represents this particular second argument. So make sure that when you are passing information through functions, order does matter because of how it's pulling in the data. Then lastly, we are talking about naming. Again, when you're naming your functions, just be specific and follow the language best practices as well as not using keywords, and also be a lot more descriptive of what the function is actually doing. So you should name your function sum or print cars if it's summing up numbers or if it's printing cars. Just make sure that when you are creating your functions, to use them, you just call them by calling it by its name. So that's why naming is a very important thing. You might have to pass in parameters with that as well. So that pretty much sums up with methods and functions. Later on, when we include the series of all of the fundamentals, we will begin to see how we can use this and implement functions and methods within our code or projects. So that will come a little bit later on within the timing of the YouTube videos. But if you have any questions, feel free to comment below all your questions, and I will see you in the next video. See ya.